Again, it's so great to be here today, folks. My name is Mujtaba Mohammed, proudly serve and represent Mecklenburg County's 38th Senate District, and proud to represent many of you across North Carolina in the North Carolina Senate. I just want to begin by showing you these quotes right here that you see on your screen. I can't breathe. Please don't kill me. I'm about to die. These are the very words uttered by George Floyd, while a man that swore to protect and serve the community held his knee on the neck of this Black man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until he took his last breath. Joining him are other familiar names like Keith Lamont Scott, right here from Mecklenburg County, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, just to name a few. The tragic part, my friends, is that we only know these names because they had to pay the ultimate price for being Black in America with their lives. For years now, communities of Black people and other people of color have been protesting police brutality, lack of police accountability, and overall how harmful our criminal justice system is and has been for these communities. And last May, these frustrations reached to a boiling point after the brutal and unnecessary murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department. Calls for a swift change were heard around the country and even the world, and including places like North Carolina. So in June of 2020, Governor Cooper created the Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice, which is now commonly known as TREC. And the reason for that is that everyone deserves an equal chance at freedom, justice, and their life. This task force was headed by Attorney General Josh Stein and North Carolina Associate Justice on the Supreme Court, Anita Earls. This task force consisted of over 24 members from a wide range of backgrounds. And we were all convened to address this issue of racial equity in our criminal justice system. These members included community advocates, elected officials like myself serving in the North Carolina Senate. We had state and local law enforcement agencies participate, justice-involved individuals, victims and disability rights advocates, and representatives from the judicial branch, and so many more. The task force developed and proposed over 125 policy solutions to address systematic racial bias in the criminal justice system and submitted those for legislative, executive, and municipal recommendations across North Carolina. These comprehensive recommendations, my friends, cover everything from mental health, policing, use of force, the issue of court fees and fines, and even things like decriminalization of marijuana. The task force members met twice a month as a full group and met even more frequently as we participated in working groups. We divided our work group into 4 different work groups: law enforcement management, policing and policy practices, court-based interventions to end discriminatory criminalization, advancing racial equity in trials and post-conviction. So as you can see, there's a thorough effort made to focus on every single facet of the justice system. We also consulted with a number of outside groups, academics, experts, and most importantly, the citizens of North Carolina. We held over 6 listening sessions to hear from community leaders from different parts of the state. We have a number of public comment sessions. So there was extensive public input placed in these recommendations. Looking at the different groups and what they looked at, we looked at recruiting and retaining diverse and a racially equitable workforce in law enforcement training to promote public safety and building community support, law enforcement accountability and the culture, looking at use of force, the investigations, community policing, diversions to arrests and other alternatives to arrests, appropriate use of school resource officers, because we know how prevalent the school to prison pipeline can be. We looked at pretrial release and bail practices, the charging decisions of even prosecutors, the juvenile justice system, racial equity training for prosecutors, judges, probation officers, decriminalization of substance abuse related crimes, poverty related crimes, looking at phases of the criminal justice system when we're looking at criminal trials, the use of impact fees, driver's licenses, death penalties, sentencing disparities, and a whole host of other issues. And all this to get a better sense of what and where the inefficiencies in our justice system were, while also collaborating together as a task force to find new solutions. And by mid-December, we released our recommendations, all of which now is available to you to look at the North Carolina Attorney General's website. And you can look at the complete report there. But real quickly, let's start with reimagining public safety and reinvesting in our communities. Because we're talking about adapting strategies and augmenting resources for responding to situations where you're dealing with individuals with mental illness, autism, intellectual disabilities, potentially substance abuse issues, homelessness, and so many non-emergency related situations that so many law enforcement officers frequently respond to. For example, when you get 911 calls, which may involve criminal behavior, but the reality is that the root of the problem, that crisis, is not criminality. Responding to individuals in crisis is not the core purpose of law enforcement at the time. And the reality is so many law enforcement officers, not just across the country, but even right here in North Carolina, receive very much limited training on how to deal with individuals facing crisis. So our task force has made recommendations about adding crisis intervention training for all new and current law enforcement officers, funding grassroots organizations that employ promising and peaceful strategies to help communities promote public safety while mitigating racial disparities in criminal justice involvement, providing funding and assistance to communities to help develop violence prevention programs, which are all critical. When we turn to looking at reforming law enforcement, when we look at accountability, transparency, and investing in law enforcement officers, agencies, to make sure that they have quality training. We're talking about having law enforcement departments enact use of force policies. At the minimum, they prohibit things like chokeholds, and putting your knee down on a potential suspect, like you saw happen to George Floyd. Making sure that officers have a duty to intervene in these types of situations. Prohibit police officers from using use of force when they're potentially retaliating against subjects that are running away from them or talking back to them. Requiring officers to only utilize the most minimum amount of force reasonably necessary to apprehend a suspect. Requiring police officers to have first aid kits and making sure that they also have a duty to render aid, where now they're saving lives. And some of the biggest things are actually defining and collecting use of force data. Oftentimes we don't do that in North Carolina. Defining what use of force is. Fully investing, and this is the key that I talked about, making appropriate investments in law enforcement. This is what this is about. When we're looking at making sure that police officers have de-escalation tactics, crisis intervention training, implicit bias training. These steps will increase public safety in our community. It will protect police officers, and it'll protect the community at the same time. And then we also have to take steps to recognize that, look, officers have a very difficult job, and we've got to make sure that we're investing in their mental health and emotional needs so that they can properly do their job as well. When we look at continued law enforcement accountability, at present, North Carolina has very few civilian oversight boards, and those that exist have very little meaningful authority. I'm here from Mecklenburg County in Charlotte. Our civilian oversight boards have very little authority. They've been requesting for things like subpoena powers for quite some time, and that power lies in the General Assembly to make that available. So those are the types of recommendations we've made there. Expanding investigative and oversight of authority of these boards, standardizing and making mandatory law enforcement data collection and reporting all types of stops and arrests so we can look at the data to see where the racial disparities are there. Reforming the type of investigation and prosecutions for incidents involving the use of force. We're looking at enacting and designating statutes that require the State Bureau of Investigations to investigate officer-involved shootings and other incidents. Maybe potentially appointing a special prosecutor to handle officer-involved use of force incidents. So these are very common reforms that many other states have been looking at. So we're trying to make a number of these a reality in places like North Carolina as well. When we look at pretrial release and accountability, look, my friends, my day job, even though I serve in the North Carolina State Senate, I'm also an assistant public defender. So I've seen how our government can potentially contribute to the criminal justice system being a tragic failure for so many people. The reality is in places like North Carolina, judges are supposed to have a preference where they're not necessarily making financial obligations a reason for an individual's reappearance to handle their trial. So one of the ways that we can reform our criminal justice system, which disproportionately affects people of color, is looking at the pretrial release, ending things like cash bail, which impact poor people, which are increasingly incarcerated at much higher rates than anyone else. And if the reality is, I can tell you, when individuals are locked up, even for minor crimes, and majority of criminal charges across North Carolina are nonviolent offenses. And when folks are sitting in jail cells because they don't have the financial means to get out while awaiting a trial, this means they've lost their job now. This means they've lost their housing. Now they're dealing with other mental health and substance abuse crises potentially. So this is where government and us as a state, unfortunately, are contributing and exacerbating problems of people. So we're looking at reforming our cash bail system. And another thing that we're also recommending is requiring attorneys participate early on in the process. Right now in places like North Carolina, necessarily we don't have attorneys at first appearance stages where folks are sitting in jail almost a couple of days. So we're recommending that there's a mandatory within 48 hours there's first appearances and appointment of counsel for all type of criminal charges, including class 3 low-level offenses, which our General Assembly took away because of financial reasons. But the reality is that has also contributed to the injustices of the criminal justice system. When we look at the role of the courts at the end of the day, that they play, especially prosecutors, the reality is that this task force recommendations, although many need to be done by city councils and county commissions and even state legislatures stepping up and making these reforms a reality, prosecutors' offices can begin to act on this tomorrow. This is why it's so critical that each of you is participating in this conversation to making sure that prosecutors are making wise charging decisions, focusing on real crime, because they wield a ton of power. And we've got to encourage them to adopt evidence-based reforms to eliminate racial disparities in our criminal justice system. And that begins even also looking at the role of how unfair sentences take place, fines, the way folks are forced into plea deals because they want to make sure they can keep their jobs and their housing, but now they have criminal charges. Well, those are not collateral consequences. Our task force has also looked into the habitual felony laws and making changes there, looking at ways where people under 21 especially aren't facing those types of criminal charges, and now we're not making sure that we're destroying a child's complete future. So we've got to encourage prosecutors to begin looking at more second chances, continuing to support diversion programs, and making sure that we're also eliminating the reality of cost associated with those diversion programs, because many people can't afford a substance abuse program. Many people can't afford a program for mental health treatment. So we're asking prosecutors to keep those things in mind as well. I know this is a lot of information, but we're also looking at here where the role of juries play in our criminal justice system. You know, our Constitution guarantees a jury of our peers. So we want to make sure that we have people who are truly objective and understanding of the capacity that they are participating in. One of the recommendations that we've had is that jurors should also get some sort of implicit bias training, which would help ensure that we have a fair criminal justice system. But going forward, my friends, as far as the task force, we are now have quarterly meetings, which are taking place to keep up the conversation and provide necessarily updates and progress amongst ourselves and to the community. As one of the only state senators and one of 3 legislators that served on this task force, my office is currently, we just got back into session in January. So we're diligently working across the aisle, working also with DAs and sheriffs and chiefs of police and community advocates and victims' rights advocates to come up with some of these great concrete solutions that we have in this task force report to make them a reality. So some of the proposals that we're working on is making sure that we have adequate funding of drug treatment and mental health courts, funding for those diversion programs, making sure that we are decriminalizing things like marijuana, deprioritizing the prosecution of those things so prosecutors and law enforcement can focus on serious violent crimes, eliminating things like life without parole for children, juveniles, also making sure that our children aren't prosecuted. North Carolina is one of the youngest states where we prosecute children as young as 6 years old, which is absolutely unacceptable. I started on my legal career representing children and families at the Council for Children's Rights, and I've seen the negative consequences on both children and families when we prosecute young people as young as 8, 9, or 10 years old. So those are some serious reforms that we need to make. But let's ask ourselves at the end of the day, by the time we have ended this conversation, how many more people will have paid the heaviest price of being Black in America? You know, we will not have justice until we have accountability in reforms in our policing. We can't have justice until we are angrier about the loss of life than we are about the loss of property. We will not have justice until those that always quote Martin Luther King on their social media begin to not only believe those words, but begin to live by them. And we won't have justice until we fill those empty words like all men are created equal and inspire a new generation of Americans and North Carolinians that want to make sure that everyone in our country is treated fairly and justly and equally under the law. My friends, we have a lot of work to do. So one of the things that I've been asked to do with this conversation that we're having with you, I told you we are working on in the General Assembly a number of these proposals, over 125 recommendations from this task force report. We're drafting these bills, we're having conversations with community leaders, associations, and again, working across the aisle. But the reality is many of you that are across this wonderful state, you might not necessarily vote for me. I might not be your state senator or your state House representative. But the thing is, I need each and every one of you on this call to begin to have these conversations with your very own state legislator. Go to ncleg.gov, look them up, type in your address, find out who your state senator is, who your House representative, and tell them, look, we've got to move our country forward. We've got to move North Carolina forward. We can't afford to see more Black and brown lives lost. We've got to move forward as a nation, as a country, and have these hard conversations about the racial inequities in our criminal justice system. A lot of these recommendations Governor Cooper will implement through his own executive authority, which he can, and which we'll continue to ask him to do. We're asking local city councils and local law enforcement, whether it's sheriffs or police departments, to look at these task force recommendations because law enforcement has participated in them, and really look at these and begin to implement these recommendations on their own. And then of course, there's the heavy left in the legislature, like I just talked about. So continue to have those conversations in your community. My friends, the reality is from its inception, our country has been bolted by a deadly rock of racism. However, I want you to know with every protest, with every event like this one that we're having tonight, every public comment at a local government meeting, every PTA meeting that you attend or neighborhood association meeting that you attend, or every march or rally, or every election that you must participate in, we are chipping away at our dark past in our country and moving forward when you bring these conversations to light and you are creating a better world. So help us replace that dark past and dark history with a foundation built on love, acceptance, joy, and opportunity. But we can only do that if we work together. So I look forward to continuing to have this work, having more events like this where we share valuable information and accurate information. I'm looking forward to joining the panel tonight and answering questions. But I would urge each and every one of you, again, to go to Josh Stein, the Attorney General's website, take a look at that task force report, and get to work. Tell your local leaders, look, enough conversation. Here's some fantastic recommendations. Sheriff, I need you to implement it. Mr. DA, I need you to implement it. Madam Mayor, I need you to implement it. Mr. State Senator, I need you to do this. Governor Cooper, let's get this done. It takes a village, so I'm honored and proud to serve you and work with each and every one of you. Thank you.